Great. Thank you, Jeannie, for getting us live. This is Senator Brian Campion. You are in Senate Education, and it is January 20th, Wednesday. And we are starting today with Chloe Wexler, who is going to continue with our walkthrough and educating us on education finance. So with that, Ms. Wexler, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. So let me share my screen here. So the last time we were here, I started to sort of go through an overview of Vermont education finance system, and it was sort of, we discussed the possibility of sort of coming in and trying to focus a little bit more on a couple of specific questions. And so I've tried to sort of reimagine the introductory presentation in such a way that we'll sort of more directly look at some actual examples and sort of walking through those to answer some of the questions. Senator Chittenden did send 4 questions, so I think that the slides will touch on the questions that you've asked, Senator, and please raise your hand if you have any more my screen sharing is paused. How did if you would like any more information on that? So
that's great. Yeah, this should be free flowing. So if people have questions while Ms. Wexler is presenting, best to get them answered while it's fresh.
Yes, please. So the first question, so sort of just again, starting just with an overview of what I just said, we're going to go over a couple of the components. Specifically, we're going to look at how school budgets affect tax rates, how homestead property and homestead income taxes are calculated, and any other questions that are raised by the committee as we go through this. So the first question that Senator Chittenden asked was specific to the non-homestead property tax, and I think that this could be a good place for us to start, because so we do have sort of 2 broad classifications of property. One is the non-homestead.
So Chloe, just so everybody knows, would you just are you going to frame it by asking his question, or?
Sure. I can directly read his question. I was just going to go through the broad overview of the.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Terrific.
I think this slide will answer his question, but I was just going to sort of walk you through a broad overview of the non-homestead property tax as a way to answer a question about the non-homestead property tax.
And Senator Campion?
Yes.
Could I just ask where this document is? Is it on our website?
I just finished it.
Oh, okay.
So
I thought I had lost it, Chloe.
No, you didn't. I was to say that I was finishing it last minute, I think would be fair. So I'll send it to Jeannie after.
Okay, could you send it to us sooner so we could? It's a little hard on our screens.
Okay, yeah, I can email it all to you right now. I'll just respond to.
You just email it to Jeannie. She'll send it out to us.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry.
Senator Campion.
Yes, Senator Chittenden.
I don't want to hold us all back. So if you all have a good grasp on education funding in Vermont, then I'm happy to offline these questions with some more directed education. So please don't feel like you have to go through my remedial understanding.
Yeah.
I'm happy to dig into the right sources if you just point me in the right direction.
I appreciate that.
Your questions were great. Your questions were great. I think the questions that you have, the entire committee has, and so that's sort of why I did want to sort of put it into this sort of PowerPoint format where we would go through them to sort of try and a little bit broaden the questions, but also answer them. So I did just send that document to Jeannie.
Great.
So you will be able to see it as well. So, okay, so I guess we spoke about this a little bit last week, but just sort of stepping back for a second, in Vermont, we have sort of 2 classifications of properties. We have non-homestead and homestead. And the question that we're going to be talking about here really is the notion that all non-homestead properties are taxed uniformly across the state. So there's one non-homestead tax rate, and it's different from the homestead tax, which does vary town to town. The non-homestead tax is uniform statewide, and all non-homestead properties contribute equally to the education fund. And so I actually wanted to give a little example of this, since I think that will be helpful. So we're going to talk about two stores in two different towns. So non-homestead property, call it a general store, it doesn't matter. And I just wanted to illustrate that both of the stores will pay the same property tax rate. The difference in any amount of property tax paid will be the difference in the fair market value of that property. So if one store was, let's say, in a downtown area, it might have a higher value than a store that was, a rural store, but they pay the same rate on that value. In this particular example, we're going to assume that both stores actually have the same fair market value. And we're going to sort of just step through what that calculation would look like for those two stores. And this is also going to give us a little bit of a reminder about the common level of appraisal, because to ensure that both of those stores are taxed at the fair market value of the property, that's where the CLA comes in. And we'll see that in this example. So let's say a store in Northfield is listed at $300,000. The date of the last reappraisal was 2005. So it's been a while. That means that they have a CLA of about 85%, which means that the listed values on their grand list are actually below the current sale price of the property. So we're assuming for this example that this property would be valued at about $380,000, which you can see because that same store, which we're assuming has the same value of $333,000 in Montgomery, was reappraised last year. So their CLA is 99%. So again, this is sort of like the first thing to wrap our heads around, right? Is that we're talking about two stores that have the same value, but because they're located in two different towns that have reappraised on a different schedule, that's why they have two different CLAs, and that's inherently why they will end up having two different tax rates, but they will contribute the same amount. So you apply. So is everybody sort of on board there? Yeah? Oh, great. So this is sort of just setting the stage. We have these two properties. These are the two CLAs, and we are going to apply the same statewide non-homestead rate to both of those properties. But in order to account for the differences in when those properties were last appraised and the current fair market value, we need to adjust the tax rate that is applied to those parcels by the common level of appraisal, which gives us the local non-homestead tax rate. In the case of the store in Northfield, it is $1.77. And in the case of the store in Montgomery, it's 1.96 cents, much closer to the statewide rate because their CLA is very close to fair market value. And then when we actually do the multiplication to determine the amount of tax paid, you can see that they end up paying very close to the same amount of property tax.
Chloe,
Okay?
Chloe,
Yes.
Why is it 89% on the CLA adjusted line?
Why here it should say 85%.
Yeah,
I
okay,
made a
good.
mistake.
I was gonna make-
Because I changed it to 80. I originally in my example I had it at 89,
Oh,
but I
okay.
changed it to 85 to try and make the numbers easier.
Got it. Good
I
work.
will I'll fix that and send the updated slides to the committee. But that's
No, not a
that means
problem. I
you're
just
paying
want to,
attention.
yeah, I want to make sure I wasn't missing something. So where did that 4% come from?
No. That 4% came from just a mistake, a change in what I wanted to do. I should have just kept it at 89%.
Okay, nope, no problem.
Okay, but conceptually, are we there with this example? Great.
Okay.
So this is great. So now we're going to move on to the homestead tax. This is a slide sort of detailing the common level of appraisal, but through going through that example, I think we've also sort of touched on this already. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the homestead education property taxes, which do vary by locally voted school budgets. So the homestead property tax rate in each town does vary in proportion to what we call education spending per equalized pupil. And what does this mean? So education spending per equalized pupil can be thought of as sort of like the average spending per equalized pupil in that district. You take total education spending divided by the number of equalized pupils to get to this education spending per equalized pupil number. And again, sort of just stepping through an example here, you have a school budget of $25 million. That school receives $4 million in categorical grants and federal offsets, which yields an education spending of about $21 million. And we touched on this briefly before, and we'll touch on it in the next slides. Education spending is a term of art, if you will, in the Vermont education finance system. And what it really is your total school budget minus any money that you're receiving from the federal government or from specific state categorical grant programs. For example, special education or transportation. And essentially what we're trying to get at is how much additional money do you need from the education fund to operate your budget? We don't need to raise the money that you're getting from the federal government. We need to raise, your budget less that amount that you're getting from the feds already. And so that's really what that number means. And then you divide your education spending by the number of equalized pupils. And we end up here in this example that the district that we're going to be sort of tracking through our slides is spending $16,925 per equalized pupil. Again, sort of just touching on here for your when you're at home looking at these slides, here's a little snapshot of education spending and equalized pupil. I think this is a good one to sort of walk through again, just because there will be continued discussions about this. What is an equalized pupil? And sort of the objective of calculating an equalized pupil is to create an average student in terms of assumed costs for a given district. And we do this because specific categories of students are assumed to have different costs than other categories. It costs more to educate a senior in high school than it does a second grader, because that senior has a lab and a field trip and a science class, and they need beakers and test tubes and all sorts of stuff of that nature. So we count the seniors at a higher rate than we count a second grader, essentially. And the cost categories that we currently differentiate are grade of study, for example, that senior second grader example, economically disadvantaged students, and English language learners. And this is a calculation that's performed by the Agency of Education. It's based on 2 years of average daily membership data. So a survey of how many of each of these types of students are in each district. And then the agency will calculate equalized pupils and sort of relay that back to the district. And it's really to account for the fact that one district may have, all seniors. Like, just imagine that one district is made up of all 12th graders and one district is made up of all second graders. If we want to compare those two districts, the way that we compare those two districts is by comparing their equalized pupil counts, which accounts for the different weighting of those students.
So Chloe, just to interrupt for a moment.
Yeah.
So as we're looking at, we have a bill before us about the last year's weighting study, and we're going to be taking through the weighting study later this week. Would you interject when you feel it's appropriate as a good example to say, hey, the weighting study, if we were to weight ESL students more, or students from rural areas, students of greater poverty, this is where and how it might impact what we're looking at?
Yes, exactly. That's exact. This is in the equalized pupil calculation is where the weighting study would impact the financing formula.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, at some point, can you explain how special needs students are factored in? Is that all? Okay.
Sure. So we currently use a categorical grant program to fund special education. So they're not explicitly counted in the equalized pupil count because we have taken special education and we have put it in its own unique categorical grant program. So it's not directly reflected in what the equalized pupils are really looking at, sort of general education costs. So you're taking a quote unquote a normal student. Like, these are cost differentials against sort of like a student that has not been identified to need special education.
And so categorical grants, just these are federal grants from Congress. Is that accurate?
There is federal money that flows to special education and some other cost categories within schools, but the state, when we're talking about categorical grants, we're really talking about state programs that provide targeted funds for a specific use. So, and that's really sort of in sort of the idea of education financing, or in the policy arena of education financing, I guess, people try to use categorical grants for targeted need. Because you're really like, you're taking X number of dollars and you're saying this X number of dollars will go to support this particular use. So for example, special education, we spend about $220 million specifically on special education. We spend about $20 million specifically on transportation. And it looks like Catherine might have something to add to that.
Please.
Which will be great.
Hi, I'm not very good with the lower. I'll lower my hand first. I'm Catherine Benham from the Joint Fiscal Office, and I wanted to echo what Chloe's saying. I actually wanted to tie it back into your discussion, Senator Campion, about the weighting study, because the weighting study is one way to address needs, and there's also categorical aid, which is another way to address needs. And it's a discussion that you all will get into more, but there are two different ways to try to address different needs that different schools have. And so just keep that in mind when you come back around to the weighting study, that the weighting study is trying to address a set of needs, but there are other options also to address categorical aid, using categorical aid.
So along those lines, Catherine, so when we have, Chloe said we spend roughly $220 million on special education. How do we come up with that number? Is that a number because school districts are reporting students and then the state responds to that number?
Well, it's interesting because there's actually, I think Chloe will have to speak to the new formula. There's a whole new vision about special ed, but the old special ed currently is essentially it's a reimbursement, right, Chloe? You can, but there's a whole new, and you may not want to get into it right this minute, but
Sure. Okay.
there's Act 1, is it 173?
173.
Yeah, which is going to change that as well.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I think that's a conversation that we will be having in your committee, and it might be helpful to get a refresher on the current status of Act 173 and how that is how they are hoping that will change special education delivery in Vermont. But so for now, we'll just stick with we'll stick with some higher level questions here. And so yes, when we're talking about the weighting study, one way that the weighting study might be factored in is through equalized pupils. It could also potentially be factored in through categorical grants. But we use equalized pupils, like I said, to come up with basically this special magic thing called education spending per equalized pupil, which is in turn what we use to set the property tax, the local homestead property tax rates. And so how do we do that? What is the interaction between education spending per equalized pupil and tax rates? And the answer to that question is the yield. And so we're going to give a go at giving another explanation of what the yield is. So by statute, there are base homestead and income rates set in statute. And those rates vary based on what you decide to spend. And what you can sort of think about, a way to think about the yields is that for $1 of tax rate, so if you were to have a tax rate of $1, you could spend $10,220 per pupil, and that $10,220 per pupil, per equalized pupil, that is the yield. So the yield is essentially the amount of education spending you can achieve, I guess, with a tax rate of $1. So sort of rephrasing this even one more way, like just one more time, a way to think about the yields is that for every $10,220 spent per equalized pupil, the homestead tax rate will be $1. So back to our example, our district decided that they were going to spend $16,925 per pupil. That is obviously above the yield, sort of the guaranteed amount of $10,220. And so we have to adjust their tax rate accordingly. And how do we do that? We take their per pupil spending divided by the yield, and then we get so 16,925 divided by 10,220 gives us a tax rate of 1.65. And let's try even a simpler example. Imagine that the yield was $10,000. Okay? And that means that for every $1 of property tax, and so when we're talking about $1 of property tax, we're talking about a rate of $1 per every $100 of homestead property. Okay? And so for that $1, you could spend $10,000 per kid. If you decide to spend $15,000 per kid, then your tax rate will be $1.5 for every $100 of property value. Does that make sense?
Questions, anyone? Please, Senator Hooker.
Chloe, you mentioned guaranteed yield of $10,220.
Well, so yes. I mean that, so, yeah. I didn't mean not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed yield. What I was trying to explain is that wherever the yield is sort of like the moving piece in all of this, that ends up linking education spending per equalized pupil and tax rates. And the way that is done is to say the yield, wherever that number ends up landing, is the amount of money that you can spend per equalized pupil to achieve a tax rate of $1 for a tax rate of $1. So
but I'm just trying to clarify, like your
Yeah.
use of the $10,220 per pupil for 2019 is statewide? Is this what we're guaranteeing that every student gets? That's all I need.
yes,
Okay. And then
exactly.
anything that the district does beyond that is going to raise their yield,
Raise their tax
their
rate.
tax rate.
Yes, but that is a good way of, that is a way to think about it.
That's a great question. Yeah, that was really terrific.
That was very well phrased. And so just sort of trying to reiterate that is that in any given year, the yield is the amount that every student in this, we could give every student in the state $10,220 if every school district said that they were only going to spend, only wanted to pay $1 in property tax rate across the whole state.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Perchlik.
Thank you. Chloe, so does the yield change every year, or this makes it seem like it's...
The yield does change every year, and the yield often changes throughout the year. And that's really because the yield moves with sort of the revenues in the fund. So, for example, we make estimates about how much money is going to be available in the fund for sales tax, for meals and rooms tax, we also make estimates on how much money we're going to be able to bring in from the non-homestead tax. And so there's all these moving pieces that will change the amount of money that we can provide for a tax rate of $1.
Okay. And then you set it, though, once a year, you say it will be X for this school budget year.
Yes, when we've found out, and it also depends on how much schools want to spend, right? Because the more schools spend, the more money we need to provide, and so there is that interplay there as well. But we do, at the end of the year, to the best of our knowledge, based on everything that we know that's going on, we set that yield so that we can say, based on what we see in the education fund, we think we can provide, $10,500 per student.
Okay. And just as a follow-up on your first bullet point on that slide, should it be $100 of the homestead property or 2%? Because that's the way I think of it. It's not and, but it's an or.
Yeah, I think that could be an or, absolutely.
And the yield, Chloe, is set in finance and Ways and Means.
Typically, in the past couple of years, the yield has been set in those money committees. Yes.
Senator Chittenden.
So that's where my questions really are.
Yeah.
The moving number that you just described and how the finance committee is determining that yield is the big question mark to me that I'm not going to use our committee's time in diving deeper in this. But can you explain to me, I think I just heard you say the yield is mostly determined by the approved school budget statewide. My question to you is, does the yield fluctuate based on if more revenue comes in from the non-homesteads, or if the non-homesteads are doing just fine, the yield is not going to be affected by how much in the revenues in the non-homestead revenue stream for property taxes, for school funding?
No, so it is all interrelated. And yeah, it is all interrelated because we try and set the tax rates so that every sort of type of property taxpayer will experience the same average increase. So if all the budgets come in the state and schools decide that they were going to spend more than we anticipated, so we estimated that schools were going to spend an additional 2%. And that's where we initially set the yields. And then budget information comes in and actually everybody's going to spend 3%. There'll be an increase for homestead property taxpayers, and there'll be that same increase for non-homestead property tax payers. And so that sort of like increased contribution from the non-homestead properties will in turn, we factor that into what we're able to guarantee for a property tax rate of $1. Tricky, we can dive into it a little bit more if you'd like,
But all the while, the grand lists are fluctuating. So if the grand list for the non-homestead grows, then that 3% is going to generate additional revenues. I don't want to waste this.
Yeah, no, we do. I will let you know that we do factor in appreciation as well.
There's no wasting of anyone's time, so please
Yeah,
ask.
no, there's no.
I'm sure these are on everyone's minds, and it's only helpful to hear them.
Absolutely.
Chloe, can I just pipe in?
Sure.
The one other thing is also if you have for example, we have the education fund has got a lot more revenues, non-property tax revenues, and that affects things also. So it's not just the property tax that can change the yield. It's other.
Such as?
Sales tax. So when we get to the education fund walk through it, you will see that it's a very different situation now, but you basically have found there's an additional $70 million in FY22 of revenues that we were not anticipating from non-property tax sources. So that impacts everybody as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, sort of part of our the yield is really what ties everything together. Our entire, like the entire like statewide sharing. And it really is that we all share. And so we share every revenue, we share every dollar that comes into the fund. And so that yield moves based on what revenues are in the fund, in the education fund. And that could be that sales taxes have increased. And then we reduce property taxes, or like, what Catherine is talking about here, or there's big grand list growth. And so, we all of a sudden are receiving more, property tax for that same dollar. And so that's all factored in. Yes?
Yeah, Chair Kempion.
Oh, yes, please.
So following up on Senator Perchlik's question regarding the first bullet point, the or, would it also be accurate to say $1 for $100 of homestead property or 2% of household income, whichever one is lower? Is that how income sensitive? Okay, so that would be a correct statement. Thank you.
That would be a correct statement. And actually, what I thought would be helpful is to actually walk through two examples. I thought that might be a nice way to sort of try and solidify this in our heads. So, how are property tax rates applied to homestead parcels? Okay, so let's go back to our school district that was spending $16,925. That they had a homestead property tax rate of 1.656 and a household income tax rate of 2.73%. In this example, they have a common level of appraisal. We're back to 89% here in this example, which gives a property tax rate of 1.861. And so again, that's adjusted to account for the fair market value of property in that town. The grand list value of that property, the homestead property value is $450,000 in this example. I think we touched on briefly that there is a sub-definition of homestead property, which is the house site. And the house site is the principal dwelling and up to 2 acres of contiguous land. And it's the house site that we base the ability to pay based on income on. So Senator Chittenden, this is touching on a little bit of one of your other questions, is that we will not fully adjust the entire value of somebody's property. So if you have 30 acres, you're not eligible to pay all 30 acres of property tax based on your income. You're eligible to pay only your house site on income. And that's to sort of account for the fact that, not everybody has 30 acres of land. And that additional acreage is really, that that additional acreage is providing additional value to that taxpayer that not all taxpayers have. And so we specify just the house site. So in this example, the house site is valued at $400,000. You can see that's less than the homestead property value. So we can imagine that, this let's for the sake of argument say that the homestead is 3 acres, that they have 1 additional acre, and that their house and 2 acres is eligible for adjustment. Their homestead property tax, so this is the property tax on the entire property, all 3 acres, would be $8,735,000. 7,444 of which is attributable to just the house and 2 acres. And so it's that 7,444 which they're eligible to pay for. They're eligible to receive sort of assistance on, or to pay based on income on. Sort of 2 different ways of thinking about the same thing. We will show how that is done in this next slide. So this resident has a household income of $75,000. So that means that the maximum house site property tax that they are eligible to pay based on their income is $75,000 times 2.73%, which is $2,048. But the resident paid $7,444 of house site education tax. So therefore, the filer is eligible to receive a credit that is the difference between what they paid on property tax and what they were eligible to pay based on their income. And in this scenario, it's $5,397 of property tax credit that this filer will receive. So I'm just going to pause there for a second. Yes, perfect.
Senator Chittenden.
So the 2.73%,
Yes.
that is a table that we set as a legislature where those thresholds are based on the income of 75,000. We have set the max to be 2.73%. Where did that number come from?
That number comes from, when we were talking about the yield. So we sort of dialed in on the homestead yield, but there's also an income yield. And the income yield adjusts that income percentage. And so the base, similar to where we're saying what?
Because of the CLA?
Not because of the CLA, because of
it's tied to their spending, right?
It's tied to their spending, yeah.
That number is for that anybody in that town because of their spending. That 2.73% is
yes. It moves in the same way as your homestead property tax. So whereas the property yield guarantees a certain amount of spending for $1 of tax rate, we also guarantee a certain amount of spending for 2% of household income. And then, yeah, go ahead.
To follow up on that, so this is the question I asked you in email.
Mm-hmm.
I see that you're adjusting for acreages beyond 2, but what about a $1 million home with somebody that is only making a small amount of reportable income? Are we going to give them an income tax credit so as they can stay in their $1 million home?
So that is a great question, and we're going to touch on that in the next example. No, but it's perfect. There are house site caps that are applied. So to touch on exactly what you're talking about, if you live in $1 million house and your house site is valued at $1 million, you're only eligible to receive property tax assistance in the form of, paying your property tax based on income for up to $400,000 of house site value. And so in this example, conveniently, because I wasn't trying to make it too complicated for the first example, the house site value was $400,000. And so, but if the house site value had been $500,000, this individual would pay the plain regular property tax on that additional value. So on that $100,000. In this example, you can see that a little bit in this example because they have additional acreage. And so they have to pay the regular property tax on that additional acreage. And in this instance, it's $931. So this filer would pay at the end of the day, after they've received their credit, this filer would have paid $2,000 for their house site based on their income, and then they would have paid an additional $930 for that additional acre.
And Senator Chittenden asked, is that $400,000 fixed?
So it is fixed. That is something that the legislature has set in law. If you make under $90,000 per year for household income, you are eligible to receive adjustment for up to $400,000 of house site value. If you make over $90,000, you're eligible to receive assistance for only $225,000 of house site value. And those.
I'm sorry. So how long has it been that way? And which committee sets this? Is this finance or is this Ways and Means? And is there any thought of graduating it to account for inflation and rising prices of houses? Sorry to interrupt you again, Chloe. You're doing great. This is very helpful. I really appreciate it.
Very helpful. And I know that right now, many of you are emailing Becca Ballant trying to get off of this committee. The reality is a lot of this does reside in finance, but this has been already one of the best discussions I've had, and it's helping me immensely. So
great, thank you.
Hopefully.
So to answer your question on when those caps, those caps, the last time they were adjusted was about 2 years ago. And they were actually adjusted downward slightly. So I think it was in FY 2019, those caps were changed. They used to be $500,000 if you were under 90,000 and $250,000 if you were above 90,000. And those caps were actually brought down slightly. And that is sort of a legislative policy decision as to, sort of what you think is, I guess really like what you consider to be like an average home, or like if you can sort of see where I'm going with that, that's very much like how much do you want to support people in being in more expensive homes, essentially. And there is no inflationary index that is linked to it at this time. It's actually just a fixed number. Okay, so we're going to do another example just to really go for it. Okay, so same tax rates. This time we're looking at a homestead property value of $250,000 and a house site property value of $250,000. So this filer doesn't have any additional acreage. The homestead and the house site property tax are then the same for this example, and it's $4,653. This resident's household income is $105,000, which means that the maximum house site property tax that they're eligible to pay based on income is $2,867. But now here's where we remember that for filers over $90,000, they're only eligible to receive adjustment for up to $225 of value. So they'll pay the straight property tax on that additional $25K. And so what we see here is we see that, so 225,000 times the property tax rate would have been $4,187. And that is the amount of property tax that they paid that they are eligible for adjustment on. Of which, so then we get 4,187 minus 2,867, which is how much they were eligible to pay based on their income. And that yields about $1,320 in property tax credit. The filer must also pay the property tax on the additional value above the house site cap. And in this scenario, that additional amount above the house site cap is $466. Does this make sense?
Video
Great.
right now.
Great. Okay. A big demystifying property tax credits. So this is just a little summary of what we've talked about here. About, and property owning residents of Vermont are eligible for assistance to pay property taxes based on their household income, which is the calculations that we've just gone through. The property tax credit is limited to the house site, which is the home and 2 acres, and the full homestead property tax rate is owed on additional contiguous acreage or potentially value. The credit is calculated by comparing the property tax paid to the maximum amount that they were eligible to pay based on their income, and they will be credited that difference. Here's the next kicker, which we're going to talk about, is that the property tax credits are applied to property tax bills in the following year, which is something that I'm sure you guys have heard about. And I sort of wanted to give an example of this property tax credit timing and how this works in our system. So I'll take myself as an example. Okay. I just paid my property taxes in the fall of 2020. I was essentially paying my property taxes to support FY21, fiscal year FY21 taxes. And to run schools from September 2020 to June 2021. Okay, so I paid my taxes. I paid based on property. I then file my income on April 15th of 2021. And okay, here I go. My income was whatever it is. It's made up. It's $60,000. Okay. And I've also at that point, I declare that I lived in Vermont for that entire year prior. And when I paid my property taxes in the fall of 2020, the state now knows that I had $60,000 of household income available to me at the time when I paid my taxes. And so they are then able to sort of perform the calculation to determine what was the maximum property tax that I was eligible to pay at that time. So, let's say I paid $5,000 in property taxes, but then when I file in April, it says, oh, Chloe, she was only eligible to pay $3,000 based on her household income. That means that the state owes her a credit of $2,000. That's that difference between what I was eligible to pay and what I paid. And I will receive that credit in the fall of the next year on my next property tax bill. And the reason that there is that lag is really just due to the time that I'm filing my income. Okay, amazing. So this is something that comes up a lot, and it really just has to do with the income tax filing deadlines. Okay, so this table that I put in is really just a summary of what we've talked about in terms of the caps that are set in statute. And so you can sort of refer to this, but really we did touch on it. If your income is under $90,000, you're eligible to pay the lesser of the tax based on household income or property value up to $400,000 of house site value. the filer will pay education property tax on excess value and additional acres. And so this is sort of the point of this table is just to summarize those statutory elements of the property tax credit. There is one additional wrinkle, which is, it might not be, I will add this additional slide, which, oh, here it is. What? There's one additional wrinkle that I'm sure you guys have heard about, and that is the homeowner rebate, or what is called the super circuit breaker. And so this is a program that's uniquely available for lower income households in Vermont. So if you have a household income of under $47,000, in addition to sort of the adjustments that everybody else receives, this population of filers is eligible for sort of even more support, I guess, let's call it, on their property taxes. And really up into the point where you're saying that you will have a maximum education liability of a fixed percentage of your income. And that is actually a program that has been in place, I think, since before Act 60. So this has been around for a long time. And so really just what it's saying, in the same way that we perform the calculation for somebody with an income of $60,000, like we just talked about, or those two examples, this takes it one step further, and it says that that income percentage, instead of being 2.7%, it's, for someone that's making $15,000 a year, it's 1.5% is the maximum amount of property tax liability that individual homestead will be faced with. And we go one step further is to assist them on their municipal tax liability as well. So sort of just in summary, there are three tax bases that are subject to the statewide education tax: non-homestead property, homestead, with the acknowledgement that homestead can be paid either on property or household income. And so that's what we're really trying to just drive home in this slide here. When we look at the amount of money that comes into the education fund, we can see that 41% of the money that comes into the education fund is from non-homestead property. 33% is from non-property tax sources, such as sales tax, meals and rooms, purchase and use, lottery, and the remaining 26%, or about a quarter, comes in from the homestead property tax. And acknowledging that this homestead property tax, we speak about this in terms of the net homestead property tax. And the reason we say it's the net homestead property tax is to account for that income adjustment that we're making. This is just sort of identifying those non-property tax sources that were available in FY 2019. Identifying that really primarily all of the money that flows into the education fund goes directly to support schools. And just a quick introduction to the education fund outlook, which you guys, which is really sort of the legislative document that the legislature uses to sort of determine where to set those yields. So this is how we look at what is available in the fund, right? So you can see we make estimates based on, how much homestead education tax we're going to have, how much non-homestead tax we're going to have, how much sales and use tax we're going to have. And so once we determine how much money is in the fund, then we can sort of, determine how much money we can provide for a tax rate of $1. And that is how we determine the yield there. And then just a quick summary. You know, we have a unique education finance system. And the reason that our education finance system is so unique is because we have a statewide funding formula that's coupled with local administration. And so a lot of the things that are really tricky, like the yield and the CLA, we have those to keep, to sort of enable this unique relationship, right? The yield to say that across the state, we can spend, you know, $10,000, $11,000 per equalized pupil. And then schools can decide, you know, what kind of tax rate or what kind of spending they want to do above and beyond that. The school boards set those local budgets and submit them to voters for their approval. And that's how they maintain that local control over spending. And then sort of getting into the idea of how do we talk about our income adjustments, and you can sort of view the education system either as an income tax, if you just look at what people end up paying at the end of the day. You know, 2/3 of payers end up paying based on income. But the way that we do that, the way that we account for the fact that these property taxpayers are paying based on income is to provide a credit. And so in that sense, it looks more of like I paid a property tax and then I received an adjustment for my income. So it's sort of just like two ways of thinking about the same sort of thing. But it is important to note that whether you pay on property value or income, the homestead property tax rates vary directly with local per pupil education spending. Whereas the non-homestead tax rate is uniform statewide. So a lot to take in. I'm happy to continue to answer any more questions.
Senator Persley.
Yeah, so number 5 is kind of where my question is that I get a lot from constituents when school budgets are being voted on. I sometimes hear that it doesn't matter what they vote on because even though there is a connection between what their local school budget is in their local rate, it's not a 1-for-1 ratio because of these other factors like the yield that are affected by all these other factors. So instead of me trying to explain that to people, I just say, yes, that's true, but it's not a big number. It's not a big difference. Is that accurate to say? Do you understand that question?
I think I understand your question. And I think it sort of gets back to the idea that we try to set the yields so that every type of property taxpayer will experience the same average increase. So if you're voting a property tax increase, you will, let's say you're voting a 3% increase. Okay, so someone that pays totally on property will see a 3% increase. Someone that pays totally on income will also see a 3% increase. And the way that person paying on income will see that increase is in the amount of credit that they receive the following year. So if we go back to our example here, let's imagine that, you know, this tax rate is now 1.7 and the income tax rate is now 2.8, right? So this amount that the income payer was eligible to pay here now increases from 2,500, and, you know, I'm just going to make up a number. Now it's 2,200. Mm-hmm. So that has increased their, you know, what they will have contributed. But the way that it does that is sort of by reducing the amount of credit they receive. And so it is, it's a little bit more complicated to get there. But that payer, when you see your income percentage go up, that means that you will be contributing obviously a greater amount.
What they say is that, well, some other parts of the state, our school budgets are voting for all these millions of dollars of capital improvements. So we're going to be kind of paying for that anyway. So we should get our own and approve this budget. And because you're not really going to pay a lot more because of the statewide property tax calculation.
Oh, okay. So your question is more about the sharing that's going on than about how it affects individual taxpayers.
Well, a little of both. They kind of,
Yeah.
but
And I think it is, that is sort of the catch-22, right, with the system. It's you get the benefit of you get the benefit of having a statewide formula, because then it doesn't matter what your local grand list is identically and how much money you can raise to support your school, which is like really sort of what Act 60 initially did, right? So you get that benefit, but then you also, on the flip side, everybody's in the same pot. And there's only one fund. And so yes, there is that interplay between sort of all of the local decisions end up, we have to fund them all. And so yes, everybody's decision does affect everybody else.
So related to that, so when every student throughout the state gets a baseline dollar amount, is that accurate, Chloe? The 10,800 that you gave.
Yes, and
then school districts may add to that if they'd like. And at what point does a school district get penalized for spending more per pupil?
Absolutely. There is, that's we didn't touch on this in this presentation, but that is another sort of piece of the puzzle, is that we do have something called the excess spending threshold. And that is really saying that if a district elects to spend what the legislature has sort of determined is above and beyond what sort of they feel is a reasonable amount per pupil, a reasonable amount to be shared across the state, then that district will have to pay sort of an additional contribution to account for that additional spending. The excess spending threshold is around $17,800 per equalized pupil. So if a district wants to spend more than that, they will be faced with a more severe tax penalty for that additional spending.
The other thing that some senators may get questions about is the educational fund itself and what it is made up of. In other words, there's always, hey, we're using educational dollars for non-educational things. Would you say something about that, Chloe? Is there? Sure.
I think that this slide sort of speaks to that. Nearly the education fund at this point, almost every there was some changes in FY 2019 of what was in the education fund, and there were some programs that were actually moved out of the education fund and into the general fund, such as reappraisal and listing costs, and I'm drawing sort of a blank on what some of the other ones were, but the idea was to really make it so that the education fund, all of the dollars in the education fund really went directly to support education. And you can see that in this slide here, that really, right now, that really it is the case. About 83% of the education fund goes directly to school districts in the form of the education payment, which is really just another word for that education spending amount. And so essentially, schools spend 1.3, almost 1.4 in FY20 of just education spending. Then they also receive categorical grants, which is what we talked about. And they get about $274 million in categorical grants. And that makes up, 99.5% of the education fund. There's a little bit of $9 million on teacher pensions and a universal accounting and financial system. But I mean, that's the accounting and financial system that's used by the school districts.
Could I add one other piece to this discussion, which is just that Chloe's right about this split, but there is an ongoing discussion about human service costs that show up in school budgets, and that's a different conversation than accounting or teachers' pensions. But a question about what funds should be supporting those human service costs, and that's just an ongoing piece of the pie when you work through these numbers.
Senator Terenzini.
Thank you, Senator Campion. I think to piggyback what Senator Perchlik said, and I made the comment last week, and I think it's in line with what Senator Perchlik was saying, but that real pain point with taxpayers and voters is exactly right. When you go to vote on town meeting day for your school budget, and it might be up 2%, and then you find out come June 30th after the tax department does its calculations, your education tax based off of your property might be going up 7%. So it just seems like there's a disconnect. I understand it's to spread to make it fair and equitable for other school districts, but that I think is the crutch of people's frustration with education funding in the state, because you never really know what your rate's going to go up, and local school boards do a good job in many cases of trying to control costs. And we know that's difficult with the rising cost of healthcare and everything else. Special ed costs are going through the roof. And so it just isn't a real clear and transparent way of how we ask people to support education in the state, in my opinion.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, there is, some of it is the statewide sharing, and that statewide sharing really shows up through the final determination of the yield. But what you're probably also seeing is the effect of the CLA. And so that, you have your tax rate that you vote on, and that's adjusted by your education spending. And then that tax rate is further adjusted, as we've seen, by the common level of appraisal. And that's where it can get sort of additionally confusing for people and sort of create that additional disconnect, because it's a little bit less tangible for people. But really what that CLA is doing is recognizing that the value of your home has increased since the last reappraisal. But, it's hard for a taxpayer to sort of wrap their head around that, oh, but on the grand list, my house says it's $300,000. And it's like, yes, but if you were to turn around and sell your house today, you might get $400,000. And the way that we make that adjustment is through the tax rate, not through changing the value of their property.
If I might follow up also just on a historical background, I worked on the foundation formula pre-Act 60, and if you were a town receiving state aid, you didn't know what your state aid was going to be till the legislature adjourned. So it was a similar situation where you have voted a budget in March and you would not know till May or June what the state aid was going to be, so you didn't know what your tax rate was. So if you were a town receiving aid, it makes it hard. I don't dispute that, but it's not, it's a hard thing to figure out how you get around that when you've got the legislature funding as part of the process unless you come up with it a year in advance.
Yeah, and sort of that interplay of still having local control over what you spend, and sort of matching that with the statewide formula.
Senator Chittenden.
Last comment, I swear. I know you want to move on.
No, it's okay.
No.
I just want to say, on top of what Senator Terenzini mentioned, which is the complexity of property taxes, my other concern as I try to understand the system is that I think it's not incentivizing the right behaviors. When I think about pre-Act 60, my naive understanding is you have costs and then you've got revenues. And in the old days, you could either lower your costs to affect your property tax bills or raise your revenues. But now when we spread it and pool it, we're no longer rewarding communities that constrict or are frugal with their costs, or alternatively on the denominator side, motivating them to want to rezone and encourage the grand list growth that would otherwise subsidize or spread across a larger amount of generated revenue stream. So the complexity of it is one thing, but I'm also worried that it is disincentivizing growth, and it is also not encouraging or rewarding frugality. But I'm still trying to understand it, and I'm going to go to some more educational sessions and get a better grasp of this yield thing.
Great. Well, we'll talk more.
Senator Lyons.
No, I was just going to respond to Senator Chittenden a little bit. Whoa.
Oh, that's my dog. I'm sorry.
That's great. Yeah, part of the pushback for lowering budgets is local level. Remember, all the setting of the budget happens in our own towns and our school boards. So that's where the tension comes in with trying to lower taxes. Sure, there's a lot of things that happen at the state level, but reality is that it's the local folks who are making that determination in the first place, regardless of the fact that there's sharing based on the Brigham decision. It's still a local decision, and it is really difficult when people start to blame the legislature or the tax department or anybody else, because ultimately we're all making this decision together. But it is extremely complex, and that I think that promulgates more problems than anything.
One thing folks may want to do at some point is to watch finance in the thick of it. You know, you can always watch YouTube videos as the yield is being set, as some of these conversations are being had. It might be another way to engage. Senator Hooker.
Just going back, and maybe I missed this, Chloe, who sets the excess spending threshold?
It is based off of sort of a base amount that was determined in fiscal year 2015, and it is increased by inflation each year. So it can be reevaluated at any time. You know, that could be a legislative decision to reevaluate that, but that is actually something that is sort of was set at a base level and then is moving with inflation each year.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And I think just sort of to follow up on the last discussion, and maybe there would be some interest in this, but there is, you know, we could send you sort of a link to a presentation that has been done by someone in our, by Joyce Manchester in our office. And that's really a presentation about sort of some of these taxing principles. And this is what finance grapples with, and what the Ways and Means Committee grapples with is, you know, how do you sort of balance competing ideals, which is really like equity and simplicity, you know, in your tax policy. And, you know, that's the question.
If you would please email that link to Jeannie.
Sure.
I'll ask Jeannie to email all of us. I think that would be helpful as well.
Absolutely.
Other questions? Any other comments, Ms. Wexler? Benham?
I think that's probably about enough for 1 hour and a half of trying to learn education finance.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow for 2 hours to review. No, but in all seriousness, thank you. This was very, very helpful. You know, some of this, as we'll see when Ledge Council joins us at in a little while, will intersect with recent decisions. I think everybody will. That's right. There is supposed to be a quiz, and I think Chloe, we're going to hold Chloe to that action.
I just saw that. I like that. I'll get my red pen out.
Ledge Council is going to talk to us about, you know, a little bit about Brigham, a little bit of an update on Act 46, as well as the recent court decision regarding parochial schools and dual enrollment. And, you know, some of the things that Jim will be talking to us about will intersect with what we just learned. And then Friday, when we are taken through the weighting study, and next week when we look at Senator Bruce's bill, all this hopefully will get a bit of a refresher. So unless there are additional questions or comments, I think we will leave it there for now and come back at 2:45 to hear from Jim. And so enjoy a 10-minute break. And remember that we're still on Zoom, so please mute and stop your video. Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you.
No problem. Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks. You too. Jim Demaray. Jim, thanks for being with us, our Ledge Council. You know, this history I find is brought up regularly, whether it's Brigham, Act 60, Act 68, Act 46, and we also know of a recent court case having to do again with religious schools and dual enrollment. So we thought we would have Jim come in and talk to us a little bit about each of these. And so Jim, with that, thanks for being with us. We know everybody wants to get to and watch likely inaugural kinds of things. So no pressure. You take the time you need, but we won't keep people too late, that's for sure.
Okay, well, terrific. I've got my IT assistant here, otherwise known as my daughter, next to me.
Wonderful.
Okay, so I've got trouble getting this presentation up, but I think we should be okay. So we're going to screen share and find this one here. And we all set? Okay. And then go up here, sorry. So I get split screens. Okay, so thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, and can you see the slides?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so for the record, Jim Damery, Ledge Council. So this presentation, Chair Campion asked me to discuss the Rice case that came out last week on dual enrollment, but we can't talk about that case without talking more broadly about what the parameters are for using public funds to pay tuition to religious schools. So we need to start there to frame it, and we'll get at the end toward the Rice case. We'll discuss that. So we're going to start with the U.S. Constitution and where it says about religion. So there are two clauses. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, so called the Establishment Clause. So pausing there for a minute, what that gets to is we're not going to have, like England, an Anglican church that is a part of the government. We're not going to establish a religion. It also goes to the question, though, as we'll come on to, about how much support can the government provide to religious organizations without running afoul of this prohibition on making a law respecting an establishment of religion. So it goes not just to establishing a church, but also how much government support is permissible. The second clause is Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that one, of course, goes to we can't interfere as a government with the exercise of religion by individuals. So those are the two clauses we're going to talk about today. So these clauses apply to the states, not just the federal government, through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So Vermont is bound by these clauses. And there's a tension between these clauses. So the Supreme Court has recognized a play in the joints between what the Establishment Clause permits in terms of support for religious organizations and what the Free Exercise Clause compels. We'll get into that. So it's a command on the one hand, not to establish religion, and on the other hand, a command not to inhibit its practice. So, for example, a law requiring the hiring by the military of priests to minister to the troops may be viewed as a law respecting the establishment of religion because the government is hiring priests. But not making priests available may interfere with the troops' free exercise of religion because they're out in the field and they may not have any other means in which to practice their religion. So that's an example of the tension we're talking about here between these two clauses. So first question is, what does the Establishment Clause permit by way of government support for religion? And the leading case here is Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, 2002 Supreme Court. So Ohio established a voucher program that allowed taxpayer money to be used to pay tuition for both secular and religious schools. So the parents would decide how to spend that money. 82% of the participating schools were religious schools, and 96% of students using the vouchers attended religious schools. The Supreme Court upheld the program against a challenge based on the Establishment Clause on the basis that if a government aid program is neutral with respect to religion, and this was neutral because it was for both secular and religious schools, provides assistance directly to a broad class of citizens who in turn direct government aid to religious schools wholly as a result of their own genuine and independent private choice, then the program is not readily subject to challenge under the Establishment Clause. And the court imposed no restrictions on the use of public tuition funds by religious schools, so they could be used to fund religious instruction. So what we learned there is that on that first clause, the Establishment Clause, you can use, it's permissible to use state money to pay tuition to religious schools as long as the program is neutral and provides assistance to a broad class of citizens who direct the payments. Okay. So we know it's permissible. The question next is, what does the Free Exercise Clause compel? And what this gets into is the question of discrimination against religious programs or schools. The leading case here is Trinity Lutheran versus Comer, which was a 2017 Supreme Court case written by Roberts. It's known as the playground case. So Missouri created this program grant program to resurface playgrounds. So it's for safety of kids. And a church which operated a religious daycare program sought to get this grant funding and was denied because it was a church. So it brought a free exercise challenge, and the denial of that grant for that that church or that church was based on the Missouri Constitution, which provides that no money shall ever be taken from the public treasury directly or indirectly in aid of any church. It's a so-called no aid provision that's in many constitutions, state constitutions. The Supreme Court held that this denial violated the church's free exercise rights. So what it says is that the free exercise clause protects religious observers against unequal treatment and subjects to the strictest scrutiny laws that target religion for special disabilities based on their religious status. So applying that principle, the court, this court has repeatedly confirmed that denying a generally available benefit solely on account of religious identity imposes a penalty on the free exercise of religion and can be justified only by a state interest of the highest order. And the court found that Missouri's policy preference of skating as far as possible from religious establishment concerns cannot qualify as compelling. So let me pause there. So we talked initially about the Establishment Clause does permit public tuition be used for private schools for a neutrally designed program. What this is saying is that the state is compelled to provide funding to religious organizations. They can't discriminate against those religious organizations solely on account of the fact that they're religious. So if you're giving those funds to a secular school for playgrounds, to do their playground, then you can't deny it. You can't be prejudiced and deny it to a religious school just because they are a religious organization. Very importantly, and we'll come to this when we get particularly to Vermont's constitution, the court distinguished the Locke case. So in this case, this was a program by the state of Washington to provide scholarship funding to assist students with the cost of post-secondary education. It could be used at both secular and religious schools, but could not be used to pursue a devotional theology degree. So it could be used at both types of schools. It can't be used to pursue a religious degree. The court in that case denied a free exercise challenge by an individual seeking a devotional theology degree, holding that the individual's name was Davy, was not denied a scholarship because of who he was. He was denied a scholarship because of what he proposed to do. The funding at issue in Trinity was denied based on the church's status as a religious institution. So this gets into a distinction between use versus status. So what this is saying is that you can't discriminate against a religious school solely based on its status as being a religious school, but you can impose restrictions on how that money is used by the religious school. So a use versus status distinction is being drawn now under the free exercise clause. And very interesting concurring opinion by Gorsuch, I just wanted to read this with you. It said the court leaves open the possibility a useful distinction might be drawn between laws that discriminate on the basis of religious status and religious use. Respectfully, I harbor doubts about the ability of such a line. Does a religious man say grace before dinner, or does a man begin his meal in a religious manner? The distinction blurs in much the same way the line between acts and omissions can blur when stared at too long, leading us to ask, for example, whether the man who drowns by waiting the incoming tide does so by act, coming upon the sea, or omission, allowing the sea to come upon him. Often enough, the same facts can be described both ways. Okay, so we're still talking about the free exercise clause. There's a second case. We talked about Trinity. We start with playgrounds, resurfacing playgrounds. Now we're going to talk about exactly tuition, use of public tuition. So Espinosa v. Montana was decided in 2020. The opinion was written by Roberts. This is a case where Montana provided tax benefits to individuals who donated money for private school scholarships, but prohibited families from using the scholarships at religious schools. This prohibition was based on the Montana Constitution, which bars government aid to any school controlled by a church, another so-called no aid provision. Building on its Trinity decision, the court held that Montana's no aid provision violates the free exercise clause because it bars religious schools from public benefits solely because of the religious character of its schools, i.e. religious status as opposed to religious use. Roberts wrote that some members of the court have questioned whether there is a meaningful distinction between discrimination based on use or conduct and that based on status. He cites Gorsuch's concurring opinion. And he said, we acknowledge the point, but need not examine it here. It is enough in this case to conclude that strict scrutiny applies because Montana's no aid provision discriminates based upon religious status. And then the court stated that the Montana Constitution's no aid provision, which was added to its constitution in the second half of the 19th century, many states added similar provisions, so-called mini-blame provisions, was born of bigotry against Catholics, and that these provisions hardly evince a tradition that should inform our understanding of the free exercise clause. The court concluded that a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. Gorsuch wrote a concurring opinion in line with his concurring opinion in Trinity, challenging the status versus use distinction. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Vermont Constitution. I just lost my place. Here we go. Chapter 1, Article 3, which says, no person can be compelled to support any place of worship contrary to the dictates of conscience. Okay, so note the difference from the no aid state constitution provisions like Missouri's and Montana's. Vermont's provision is based on use, worship instead of religious status. So this is where this use versus status distinction really comes into play, because Vermont's constitution is different than the ones we discussed before. And note that Vermont's provision was part of its original constitution and not added later, as was the case with the anti-Catholic Blaine amendments. The leading case we have in Vermont is Chittenden versus Department of Education, decided by the Vermont Supreme Court in 1999. Vermont Supreme Court held that a school district violates the compelled support clause when it pays public tuition to a religious school in the absence of adequate safeguards against the use of such funds for religious worship or instruction. So this was a case where Chittenden, near Rutland, is a tuition town, and it was paying or wanting to pay tuition, I think it was to St. Joseph's in Rutland. And the court said, no, you can't do that, not because of the religious status of the school, but because there weren't safeguards to ensure against the use of the funds for religious worship or instruction. So the question then is, will Chittenden survive the Espinosa decision? Vermont's compelled support clause, as interpreted by Chittenden, bars the use of public funds for religious worship or instruction, in contrast to state constitutions that bar aid to churches based on status. But does this distinction matter? Roberts is hedging on that, and Gorsuch is challenging that. Vermont's compelled support clause was not part of the main Blaine amendments at the other six constitutions that were based on bigotry has its own unique history. Okay, so I'm leaving it there. Let's move on to dual enrollment. It's an open question right now as to what the Supreme Court would do if there's a direct challenge to Chittenden. The Supreme Court would say that's okay because it's a use provision, and that's okay under Espinoza. Or if it would say that distinction doesn't matter anymore, so it's not permissible. So you have to, if that's the case, then you have to use state tuition for religious schools. It's not clear how they're going to go on that question at this stage. So it's not clear what the answer to this question is. So what about dual enrollment? First, what is it? So dual enrollment is taking a class for both high school and college credit at the same time. And it's available to public school students, to approved independent school students who are on public tuition, and homeschool students. It is not available to approved independent school students on private tuition, whether attending a secular or religious school. Following the Chittenden decision, all children attending religious schools pay private tuition. So I'll just note there, that's a fact. But under Chittenden, it doesn't have to be a fact. If there was a system whereby the schools could ensure that funds weren't being used for religious worship, then under Chittenden, they could use public tuition. So the Rice case, a group of Rice Memorial High School students sued the Agency of Education, claiming free exercise clause and equal protection clause violations, asserting that denial of dual enrollment to Rice students is due to the religious status of the school. Last week, on January 15, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the students, holding that the denial was due to the school's religious status. The court noted that in the more than 20 years since Chittenden was decided, Vermont has not identified adequate safeguards to ensure public funds are not used for religious instruction. And moreover, the court noted that since at least 2010, the Agency of Education has frequently stated that public funds could not be used for students attending religious schools, a statement based on the school's status rather than its use. So I'll pause here and say that the record before the court in this case was not great for an argument that the distinction was based upon use, not status, because of the fact that we haven't developed parameters to determine when safeguards are in place to ensure funds aren't used for this instruction, A, and B, both AOE and the district involved here basically said, we're denying you based upon your status. So the court concluded that the record on this appeal plainly evidences religious discrimination. The court also said that because our decision turns expressly on religious status and not religious use, we express no view in this opinion as to whether Chittenden's requirement of adequate safeguards could, if applied, constitute a use-based restriction that survives First Amendment scrutiny. So this Rice case was decided by the Federal Court of Appeals, and if it's not appealed, then it would stand as law. If it is appealed to the Supreme Court and the court upholds it, it would be the law for dual enrollment, or it could overturn it. So it's not quite clear. It's not done yet. I'm not sure what's going to happen on appeal or if it will be appealed. But currently, the court has ruled that these students are entitled to dual enrollment. And that is the end of this presentation. So I guess I will stop my screen share for a minute and come back to you and see if you have questions.
I'm just, I'll just kick it off. So let me just run one scenario by you. a religious institution, a religious high school says, you know, we are not going to offer a senior history class or senior math class. In lieu of that, we want you to use your dual enrollment dollars. So in part, they would be eliminating a teaching position, and saving dollars because students would be taking their dual enrollment dollars to CCV or somewhere else, therefore freeing up funds that could be used for religious instruction, paying off a lawsuit, all sorts of different kinds of things, paying the minister's salary.
Yeah.
So is that what Chittenden was hoping? Is that what the kind of parameters Chittenden wanted? In other words, to say, Brian Campion, you're at Rice. Rice has to stick to its curriculum. You can use your dual enrollment dollars, that's fine. But what Rice is not allowed to do under these guidelines is in any way alter its curriculum to save money, and therefore by allowing these freed up dollars to, pay the minister's salary, pay off a lawsuit, whatever.
Yeah. So that question conflates two things, actually. It conflates the establishment clause with the free exercise clause.
Okay.
And I know where you're coming from in this, because in the old days, under the establishment clause, remember the question is it permissible for public funds to be used for religious schools? Okay. Not are you compelled to use them, but is it permissible to use them for that purpose? And we talked about that case. We said that as long as you have a neutrally designed program and parents are making the choice, you are able to use public funds for religious schools. Before that case, exactly what you're talking about was the law, which was, it used to be a diversion argument, which is to say, if you give money to a religious school, they can then divert funds because they have more funds. So even though it can basically free up other resources for religious worship. So under the establishment clause, it used to be that you couldn't do that because of this diversion argument that you're making. But as of 1990 or so, under the newer interpretation under Zellman, that argument's no longer in effect. So now diversion's gone as an argument. And now, as long as your program is neutral and the parents decide where the money goes, it does not violate the establishment clause. Okay. Chittenden is under the free exercise clause. So when do you have to pay money to religious school? When you're compelled to do that. And what the court's saying in Chittenden is under the Vermont Constitution, you can use the money to go to a religious school if the school has parameters to ensure that that money is not going to religious instruction. So if they could show a system that shows the money coming in from public tuition is going to pay for the gym class or the history class or some class that's not religious instruction, it sounds like that might be acceptable. But no schools have done that. The state hasn't developed that either. So there's been no guidance as to how that would work. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I might come back. It gives me something to think about. Senator Lyons?
So I haven't heard all of this before, so it's a lot. But I guess my question is, if you think about, has there ever been an argument in thinking about the dual enrollment program as the opportunity for the student and the child, that the money goes to the child to go to college, and that without it, at whoever this kid is, without it, then it's unequal treatment under the law? So could you consider the fact that the dual enrollment program isn't about the religious institution or the private institution or the public institution. It is about the child, the kid, going to college and increasing our college entry for Vermont students. And without that opportunity, that child receives unequal treatment.
Yes, I think that though is more of a policy argument. So certainly from a policy standpoint, you can make that argument, and there are lots of ways you could do dual enrollment from a policy standpoint. You could means test it, for example. You can make it available to all. There are different ways of doing it. The way Vermont's done it is to basically allow it for students on public tuition, basically. That's how we've done it, but there are different ways of doing it.
Interesting. I see other hands. I'm sorry, Senator Chittenden.
I'll go to your point, Chair Campion. The way I am reconciling what we've just heard is if it's for the benefit of the school, if the school for their benefit asks or has the student take the course, that seems inappropriate. But if it's for the student's benefit, for their convenience, if they opt, if the power of choice is with the student and they're not being asked to for the benefit by the school, and similar to how workers' compensation works with work from home, if the employee is benefiting and the employee chooses to work from home, workers' compensation doesn't cover them. But if the employer says, we need you to work from home because we're not giving you a workspace, workers' compensation extends to their workplace. So similarly here, I think it sounds appropriate if the student is choosing to go to do a university, a public institution through this dual enrollment program, but it is not appropriate if the religious school is opting to benefit their curriculum by requiring or demanding the students use it. I don't know.
Well, the way the program works is that the money goes from the state to the college, right? So it goes to UVM or to VSD or even private colleges. So the money goes to the college, and the students who are entitled to get that entitlement are ones on public tuition. That's how it actually works today. I can't go into the analogy you made because I'm not familiar with it, but that's just how it works now.
Okay. Senator Hooker?
Thank you. So if a student at Mount St. Joseph opts to take a course at Castleton, currently they can't, or well, perhaps after the Rice decision, no, they will be able to take that course. I'm not familiar enough with the dual enrollment program to know what the parameters are. So, and you've said that the money goes directly from the state to the college. So it seems to me that it really doesn't benefit the school unless we get into the complicated issues that Senator Campion brought up about diversion, but you've indicated that that's kind of been taken care of. So is there really anything that should preclude those religious school kids from benefiting from taking a course at a secular college, as long as it isn't a religious institution, as opposed to the kids who are on public tuition? I know that the way the program is written now, it says they have to be on public tuition, but is that the only, as far as dual enrollment, that's all it is? It's taking a college course, correct?
Correct. It's taking, I think, up to 2 college courses while you're in high school, and getting credit for both high school and for college at the same time. That's what dual enrollment is. Yeah.
So,
Okay, so in fact, it may be cutting down on their costs at the, it may be cutting down on the school's costs if enough kids take these courses and they can, I don't know, cut down on the number of classes they have. I don't know how that would play out. It
But
doesn't.
there could be a benefit to the high school, for sure. And that benefit could be for secular or religious schools, because there's no diversion argument anymore. So that the argument's gone.
So, and for me, and I'm just learning about this as well with all of you. I'm wondering. So, for example, it's in a way, let's take the law suits before the Catholic Church. Okay, if you are saying, if a school is saying we are directing their students to take, because it's dual enrollment, you get both high school and college credit. If a school is eliminating a program and therefore freeing up funds because their students are going somewhere else, I see they're not getting the dollars directly, but the line item in their budget was now freed up to go toward other things, to pay off a lawsuit, pay a minister's salary, do those kinds of things. I'm not saying I have an opinion on it. I'm just trying to pull this separation, here apart and, and just kind of understand it a little bit better. Does that make sense, Senator Hooker?
Yeah, I mean that, and I guess my question would be, how extensive or expansive would the dual enrollment from a school have to be to affect such a change?
That's a great question. I think that might be somebody would have to take action. In other words, if all of a sudden the school you referenced has 30 students in their graduating class, and they're all going to Castleton for that one class, and they've eliminated a position, you can see where that might spark attention or perhaps concern. But I think that would take additional action from students or parents to actually bring it to the court's attention. What I was wondering, in part in my question, is there a role for the legislature in any way at this point, or should we be doing anything to protect, to put parameters, to put boundaries around how these dollars may or may not be used? And I don't know the answer to that question.
And I think Jim referred to that when he talked about the Chittenden case and the fact that there were no parameters, and that's why the court ruled the way it did.
Yeah, there are a couple of things to mention. So on dual enrollment, you could take action to amend the statute. And you have the court case, as I mentioned, it might be appealed, so it's not final yet. So you might want to wait and see what happens. Or you could take up that statute and think about how you want to frame it in terms of, do you want to make it available to all students? Do you want to make it available to all students but means tested? So there are various ways you could start thinking about dual enrollment itself, that statute. On the question about the broader question about Chittenden and the whole question about use of funds by religious schools, you could come up with a statute that, for example, that directs the State Board of Education to adopt a rule which defines basically the controls necessary to show that public tuition is not being used for religious worship. So you could actually have some definition behind that, as Chittenden suggested 20 years ago. So a couple of things you could do here if you wanted to take action.
Helpful. Thank you. Senator Hooker.
And could I just ask Jim to send Jeannie this presentation as well? Because I saw on our website that there are only the two presentations on Act 60 and Act 46.
She's got them all, I think. Okay. So
they're all up.
Are they? Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. That was helpful. Any other questions or comments before Jim moves on? Okay.
I'm going to go back and screen share again. and grab the, we're doing Act 46 next, I believe. And hit that. Okay, can people see that? Can you see the slides? No?
Yes, I can see.
Yeah.
People hear me?
Yep. We
Yep,
can hear.
okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, so this is Act 46. So let's go pre-Act 46. So there's an article written by Bill Mathis that was published in Vermont Digger. And he made these points, which is that there was a so-called Vicious Act of 1892, which required town school districts to consolidate the 2,500 boards into 279 town incorporated boards. So by a sweep of a pen, basically, that was done back in 1892. And to note there, pause there for a minute, we are a so-called Dillon's Rule state, which means that the state has complete control over its municipalities. And school districts are of course, municipalities. So we can create them, we can merge them, we can eliminate them, and that's what happened here. In 1906, supervisory unions were formed. Post-World War II, we had union school districts being created. And then in 2010 and 12, we had two acts, Acts 153 and 156, which provide tax and other incentives for school districts to merge. Then in 2015, Act 46 expanded on Acts 153 and 156, providing tax and other incentives for school districts to merge and directing the State Board of Education to realign unmerged districts into more sustainable models of governance to the extent necessary to achieve the Act's goals. So this was, before it was incentives only, Act 46 was a carrot and stick approach. The goals of Act 46 were 5, equity and educational opportunities, to increase student achievement, to maximize operational efficiencies, to promote transparency and accountability, and to deliver cost at value. The structure of Act 46 was that first, that school districts cannot be forced to give up tuitioning or operating models. It said that its intent was not to close small schools, and encouraged a preferred governance structure. And that structure was the merger of districts within a supervisory union or with a neighboring supervisory district, where the combined group, now merged, was responsible for K through 12, had 900 or more students, and operates K through 12 directly, or operates K through 6 or K through 8 in tuition to other grades. So that was the preferred structure, and that was where you got the most incentives if you did that structure. Act 46 also recognized, though, that alternative governance structures may be acceptable. Alternative governance structures, anything other than the preferred structure, and required districts seeking an alternative governance structure to do 3 things. 1, to evaluate its current ability to meet or exceed the state goals. 2, meet the districts in the area to discuss ways to promote improvement in the goals throughout the region. And 3, submit an alternative governance structure proposal to the state board, individually or with other districts. Act 46 required the secretary to develop a proposal to realign unmerged districts into more sustainable models of governance. This proposal was presented to the state board by June 1 of 2018. And then the Act 46 required the state board to issue a final statewide plan by November 30, 2018 to merge and realign school districts and supervisory unions were deemed necessary to meet state goals. And Act 46 prohibited the state board from forcing school districts to give up their tuition or operating models. So the results. The state board's merger order merged, and this comes from data from Don Russo Savage. She presented this to Senate Education a couple years ago or last year. And she said that the state board merger order merged 45 districts into 39 towns to form 11 new union school districts, enlarged 2 existing union school districts, and conditionally require an additional 4 town elementary school districts to merge. That was conditioned upon approval by the other merging districts. The state board merger order did not change the governance structure of 47 districts and resulted in a net reduction of 34 districts. So in fiscal year 16, prior to Act 46, there were 267 school districts. And in fiscal year 20, after voter-approved mergers, there were 154. After the state board mergers, there were 120. And I mentioned that there were 4 additional conditional mergers. I believe they did merge. So I think we're down to 116 districts now. So there have been a number of attempts and some successes at Act 46 divorces. I'm getting this from news stories because there's no source of this information at AOE or Secretary of State. There's no data there until later in the process. So this is based upon reporting by Vermont Digger and others. But first, Halifax and Wheatsboro have voted to merge. So it was a voluntary merger, and they decided to unmerge. And that was approved by the State Board of Education, so that's been done. Newbury was forced to merge with Bradford, and Newbury voted against divorce when it came up, so it looks like they're staying together for now. Westminster was forced to merge with Athens and Grafton, and Westminster voted to divorce, but Athens and Grafton would need to approve that. And I don't believe those supposed to have happened yet. Ripton voted to leave Addison Central. That was a voluntary merger. So now Shoreham, Cornwall, Millbury, Bridgeport, Salisbury, and Weybridge will now each vote on whether to allow Ripton to leave. Tunbridge and Chelsea voted to merge, voluntary merger, and Tunbridge had a vote recently against divorce, so it looks like that they're staying together for now. And then Brattleboro, Dummerston, Guilford, and Putney were forced to merge into Wyndham Southeast and have ballot items to approve divorce. So here's the law on divorce. We got 2 laws, and they both predate Act 46, and they're a bit not in conflict. They're different standards. So 721A is the statute about withdrawal from a union school district. And it says a school district that is a member of a union school district may vote to withdraw from the union school district if 1 year has elapsed since the union school district was formed. Okay. And then 724 is withdrawal for a unified union school district. A unified union school district is one that came together as a merger of districts, either voluntarily or not, or ordered by the state board. And it says a town or city corresponding to a pre-existing school district that voted to form a unified union school district may vote to withdraw from the district if 1 year has elapsed. So the difference here, go to the next page, is you have the standards being different. So for union school district, it appears that a district can withdraw whether it voluntarily merged or was forced to merge. But for a unified school district, it appears that a district can withdraw only if it was voluntarily merged. And that's because, going back here, for a union school district, there's no condition about it having been formed by a vote. So whether it was formed by state board order or by voluntarily by vote, it can withdraw if it's been 1 year since it was formed. But this one says for a unified school district, only can withdraw if it had voted to form the district. So that means that forced mergers can't use this section, or that's how it could be interpreted. So we got a situation where the pre-existing law to Act 46 has different standards. And then in either case, for either a union school district or a unified school district, in either case, all districts or towns in the union or unified school district need to approve the member's withdrawal. So what happens is, first there's a vote of the member that wants to withdraw. If that gets approved, then all the other districts on the same day vote to approve that or not. If they don't approve it, they can't withdraw. If they do approve it, it can move forward. So if it moves forward, if they all approve it, then if the state board finds the students in the withdrawing town or city will attend a school that is compliant with its rules for educational programs, the state board shall declare the membership of the withdrawing town or city to be at an end. So the state board's got very little discretion here. As long as the students are attending another school that meets its rules, it has to allow the withdrawing town or city to withdraw. And the state board is not under law in making this decision required to take into account the goals of Act 46. So a couple issues here. One is we have two different standards for withdrawal. Don't really make sense, as I mentioned, because it would allow, for example, a union school district that was formed by state board order to withdraw, but a unified school district formed by state board order not to withdraw. So that's an issue. And then secondly, the process for withdrawal involves the state board, but having gone through all this to meet the goals of Act 46, there's nothing here in the law that requires the board to take into account whether those goals are met when that member district withdraws.
I just want to pause there for a moment, Senator Perchler.
Yeah, thank you. Jim, can you remind me the difference between union and unified?
Yeah, so union school district is like a union high school or a union elementary school where various towns come together and form a union school district. So, all kids going to grades 9 through 12 go to Woodstock High School, for example, from those towns. That's a union district. A unified district is a district that was formed by merger and is responsible for K through 12 education. So when we go back, we talked about the preferred model. We had a merger with districts that were part of a SU with 900 students, etc. That would be a unified school district because it was formed by merger and it's responsible for K through 12. Those are the differences.
Senator Perchler, do you have a follow-up?
No, I'm just still unclear, but I think I understand it sufficiently.
Do you want me to go through that one more time for you?
Would you?
Yeah, sure. So,
because if aren't there union schools that do K through 12?
Yeah, there are. Well, part of the problem is with terminology here, because a unified school district is actually called a union unified school district. So the terms are confusing. But when I'm saying union here, I mean in my example, towns might be responsible for K through 6, for example. Okay, they're not responsible for K through 12. They're responsible for K through 6. They operate school for K through 6, but they decide to get together with other towns to form a union school district, high school district, to educate 7 through 12. Okay, so that is a union school district. It's not covering all grades. It's covering, again, 7 through 12 in my example, formed by the surrounding towns to educate those students. A unified school district, by definition, came together by merging pre-existing districts, first of all, which isn't the case with the union school district. It merged pre-existing school districts to form one, and that one school district now is educating K through 12.
It might be educating K through 12 in more than one school.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm gonna stop screen sharing now, so I can see you. Okay.
Great. Other questions? Okay, thank you, Jim. That we just wanted to get an overview. I know some of these things we'll all have to get returned to at some point, but that was helpful.
Okay. Should we go to the next presentation? Okay.
Oh, I have one more question on Act 46. And that is that Act 46 map still up in the Education Committee room?
I haven't been there in ages.
Nobody's been there to find out. Okay. It was such a part of the committee room for so long.
If you want to see that map, though, it's on the AOE's website.
Right.
So
I hope to get up there maybe next week and work a day from the State House. I'll check in for you, Senator. Or maybe you can meet me over there.
Okay. So I'll go back to screen sharing and pull up this. Let's see. I just see. Yeah, this one here. Okay. Okay, so we're not talking about Brigham, but there is a line to follow here. And the line to follow is how did it work for Brigham? What was Brigham challenging, which was the foundation plan? What did Brigham say? What did Act 60 do? I'm not going to go into detail there, just one page. And then we're going to come on to weightings because Brigham, the fact pattern in Brigham is not dissimilar to what's happening in the case of the weighting report. So there's a line to be drawn here through all this. So starting with the what was happening before Brigham. Before Brigham, there was the foundation plan. These slides here are borrowed from a presentation that Peter Griffin gave when he was a tax attorney here. So I'll give credit for him for these first few slides. And what would happen is the state set a foundation amount. And in this example, it's $5,000 per pupil. And it set a base rate. In this example, it's 1%. And in this example, we have a town with a very small grand list. It's just an example of $400,000. Okay. So what happened before Brigham is that the town would raise at 1% based on its grand list, $4,000 per student. Okay, which is below the foundation amount of $5,000. So the state then would give a foundation grant of $1,000 to bring that school district up to $5,000. So that's how it worked. When you add in two towns, you begin to see the equity issue. So you have one town with a lot of property wealth and one town with low property wealth. Let's assume that both towns want to spend $10,000 per pupil. Again, just like before, the foundation plan amount is $5,000 per pupil, and the base rate is 1%. Okay, so what happens here is that the property rich town, which has $1 million grand list, can raise $10,000 per pupil at 1%. So there you go, no problem. The property poor town can raise $4,000 at 1%. It's getting a grant for the other $1,000. So how does it get up to 10 is the question. So what happens is the town has to raise in green the excess amount to get up to 10. So it has to raise the amount in green here, which is 5,000 per student. That results in the property poor town having a tax rate of 2.25%, while the property rich town has a tax rate of 1% to raise the same amount per student. And that was the equity problem that was facing the Brigham Court. Any questions on that before I move on?
I don't see any.
No, okay. All right. So the Vermont Constitution has an education clause and a common benefits clause. The education clause basically is a right to education. So it says a competent number of schools ought to be maintained in each town unless the General Assembly permits other provisions to the convenient instruction of youth. 2 comments on that. First, it's unusual for states to have an education clause in its constitution. Vermont's quite unique.
Jim, can you enlarge in your screen? You know, you just have we're seeing all the slides at once. It'd be great just to see the one.
Oh,
Or have some on the side. It would just be great to see the.
I'm not sure how to do that. Sorry.
Just whatever you were doing before.
I'm not sure what I was doing before. So,
Okay. That's fine if you can't. No big
Go
deal.
up, go up to where it says slideshow, way up above, on the up above. Right, nope, down, and go across to your, go up.
sorry.
Now keep going to your right, keep going to your right.
Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Slideshow, click on that.
Yeah.
Oh, just click on it so you get your, and then you go to from current slide over on your right on the, go up. No, to your left. I'm sorry. I got my left and right mixed up.
Yeah.
Click on that one.
Oh,
Here we go. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great.
okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
All right.
So 2 things about this education clause. First, it's unusual to have one in a state constitution. There's no education clause in the U.S. Constitution. And second, this language about. Oh, sorry, my phone is going off. Second is that it talks about you have to have a school in each town unless the General Assembly permits otherwise. So that's how we get to tuitioning. So the General Assembly has allowed tuitioning, so that's how we get to operating and tuitioning schools. Common Benefits Clause is a right essentially to equal opportunity. So it says government is ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community, and not for the particular emolument or advantage of any single person, family, or set of persons who are a part only of that community. When we put this together under the Brigham decision, there is a right to substantial equality of educational opportunity in Vermont, a constitutional right. Okay. Brigham, which was decided back in 1997, held that the then current education financing system, with its substantial dependence on local property taxes and resultant wide disparities in revenues available to local school districts, deprive children of an equal educational opportunity in violation of the Vermont Constitution. There are 2 levels of inequity in Brigham. One, taxpayer inequity, that town that had to pay 2.25% versus 1%, which led to unequal educational opportunities for students. The Brigham Court said that the distribution of a resource is precious as educational opportunity may not have as its determining force the mere fortuity of a child's residence. And the parties conceded that the foundation plan resulted in unequal opportunities for students, but the state argued that this was justified by the state's interest in promoting local control. The Brigham Court rejected this argument, holding that the constitutional right to substantial equality of educational opportunity is essentially a state mandate that cannot be overridden by local control. Therefore, the court held that to fulfill its constitutional obligation, the state must ensure substantial equality of educational opportunities throughout Vermont. Vermont's education funding system was substantially changed by Acts 60 and 68, and the Vermont Supreme Court has not, in any meaningful way, analyzed the Common Benefits Clause in connection with education since it issued Brigham. So we have no further precedent really than Brigham to rely on. Act 68 retain local control over spending decisions, but create a system of tax rate equity. So, under Act 60, two towns with the same per pupil spending have the same spending adjusted tax rate, and two homes, one in each town, would pay the same property taxes if they had the same fair market value. And this leads into the weighting factors, because there are many parallels to what's happening in this space with what happened in Brigham. So Chloe talked to you today about this, and I won't go into much detail, but just to highlight for you, we know that the property tax rate and the income sensitized rate are based on a school district's per pupil spending. And per pupil spending is determined by dividing education spending from the school budget, let's say 20 million, by the number of equalized pupils, let's say 1,500, which would result in per pupil spending of 13,333. If there were less pupils, so 1,200 equalized pupils, per pupil spending would be higher, 16,666. And if there were more equalized pupils, per pupil spending would be lower, 11,111. Actually, I've got one too many ones there. So therefore, higher equalized pupils equals lower tax rates, and lower equalized pupils equal higher tax rates. So the number of equalized pupils really matters in terms of your tax rate. And equalized pupils is determined by the weighting factors. So in order to determine equalized pupils, a number of weighting factors are applied to a school district's student count. The policy behind applying weighting factors is to provide more resources for school districts that have a relatively higher number of students that need those extra resources. So pre-K students are weighted at 0.46, about half of one person. Elementary and kindergarten students are weighted at 1, secondary students at 1.13, and students who are from low-income homes or are English language learners receive additional weighting. Weightings are a zero-sum game. So, for example, a higher weighting for one school district with more students who are from low-income homes receives a higher weighting, so lower taxes. But that results in another school district with fewer of this type of student receiving a lower weighting. So it's all a shift between school districts. This weighting factor, if you have more students versus less of certain characteristics, you're shifting tax rates among school districts. Note that the weighting system does not directly provide further resources for school districts that have a relatively higher number of students that need those extra resources, as would be the case with grant funding. So Chloe talked about that. Another way of approaching this is to give grants, which would provide funding directly for those students. The weighting system results in relatively lower educational tax rates and the ability of a school district to more cheaply increase education spending to provide additional resources. So it's creating more taxing capacity. School districts may choose not to provide additional resources, but instead benefit from lower educational tax rates. So there's a question that was not answered in the weighting report about whether, in fact, this tax system results in better outcomes for students. It definitely results in lower taxes. It's not clear that that tax capacity is being spent to help these students. Okay, so Act 173 from 2018 of the weighting factors. The weighting report found that the weighting formula does not reflect contemporary educational circumstances and costs, and that the existing weights have weak ties, if any, with resources needed. The weighting report recommends adjusting the weights and adding new weights. So going back to Brigham as our last slide. Remember that Brigham found two levels of inequity, taxpayer inequity, leading to unequal educational opportunities for students. And Brigham found that the distribution of a resource's precious educational opportunity may not have as its determining force the mere fortuity of a child's residence. So the current weighting factors may result in taxpayer inequity because school districts receive a relative tax advantage or disadvantage from the weights. May result or lead to unequal educational opportunities for students because school districts which are most in need of additional resources are not getting the taxing capacity to afford those resources. And this may result in unequal educational opportunities based on the mere fortuity of a child's residence. So that's why when you hear, I'll stop my screen share, if I can. That's why you hear that that the weighting area is the next Brigham case because it has parallels to the fact pattern of Brigham.
By that, you mean, Jim, a lawsuit is anticipated.
Yeah. So that's what people make that connection. That's why, because there are factors there that do link up.
Okay. Yeah. Questions? We're going to get into this more on Friday when we hear the report from the weighting on the weighting study will be presented to us. But any questions at this point for Jim? In this, what was an incredible everything from the U.S. Constitution to recent major education policy. Senator Lyons, please.
So, and this is kind of a high up question, and it does relate to Act 60 and our common benefits clause. So going back to unequal treatment, when the Brigham decision was rendered, did it include overall spending, or did it also dive down into programs? So I'm thinking of athletic opportunities, and I'm thinking of, I'll say dual enrollment, but maybe it didn't get that discrete. But in terms of the decision, the Brigham decision, how far down into the school did it dive?
It didn't dive down that far. And I'll say a couple of things about Brigham, because often I think it's been misquoted. So first of all, Brigham was based upon gross inequities across the state for students and taxpayers, right? So, and that was just a given in the case. It wasn't even argued. So gross inequities across the state involve both taxpayer inequity and student outcome inequity, okay? I've heard people say, every town should be able to, every school district should be able to tuition their students. It's unconstitutional under Brigham not to allow that opportunity for everyone. I've heard that it's unconstitutional for independent schools that take public tuition not to take special education students. Okay, there are a lot of people who say based on Brigham it's unequal. But remember that Brigham, as I just said, it was basically gross inequity across the whole state on the tax side and the student side. So I think that's why I also mentioned that Brigham has no further precedents after it to interpret. So we only have that one decision. So I think people can easily say it's unfair or it's unequal, therefore it violates Brigham. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And I think the argument has to be much larger than that to maybe violate Brigham.
Thank you.
Other questions? Comments? a lot to take in today. I recognize that. I appreciate everybody's time and willingness to jump into both the weighting study, educational finance, as well as everything that Jim has presented. Tomorrow we are going to move on to our first bill, which will be presented by Senator McCormick. For those of you who are new to the Senate, again, we asked the presenter to come in, talk a little bit about the genesis of the bill, and then we'll have some witnesses and folks from the Agency of Education talk to us about civic education, where we're at in this state. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for the committee to sort of talk a little bit about what direction people may be interested in going in with this or not. Any other final questions or comments for the day? Senator Hooker, everything all right? Okay. Look like you might have a question. Thank you, everybody. Jim, thank you very much. I realize how much time and presentation prep time this kind of thing takes. It was well done, and certainly helped clarify a number of things for me. And now we have these as resources to refer to. So thank you for your time.
Yep, you're welcome.
Today, but preparing for this.